Chapter 1. The Last Thousand. Opening the Vault of Survival. Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you should be impossible. You shouldn't exist, neither should I. Neither should the 8 billion people walking this planet right now. According to the cold mathematics of extinction, we should all be fossils buried under millions of years of sediment. But here we are. Welcome to a story that will change how you see yourself, your family, and every human face you've ever looked into. This is the story of how humanity almost ended. Not with a bang, not with a war, not with an asteroid, but with a whisper. A slow, grinding erasure that reduced our entire species to roughly 1,000 souls. 1,000. Think about that number. Your high school probably had more students. Your neighborhood probably has more residents. Yet from that impossibly small group of survivors, scattered across a dying world, came every person who has ever lived since. Tonight, we're diving into the vault of survival, the most dramatic bottleneck in human history. And I need to warn you, some of what we'll discover will disturb you. The methods our ancestors used to survive weren't always pretty. The choices they made weren't always noble, but they were absolutely necessary. If you're someone who questions everything, who loves science that challenges comfortable assumptions, hit that subscribe button now, because we're about to explore evidence that suggests our species' survival required behaviors that would horrify us today. We're going to examine controversial theories that some scientists fight over in academic journals and at conferences. I'm curious, as you listen to this, do you ever wonder what you would have done? What you would have sacrificed? What lines you would have crossed to ensure your children survived another winter? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because by the end of this journey, those questions will feel much more personal. Let me paint you a picture of Earth 900,000 years ago. Imagine a world where the Amazon rainforest stretched twice as far, where massive lakes covered what is now the Sahara Desert, where elephants grazed in what we call England today. Our ancestors lived in this paradise, completely unaware that they were already extinct. They just didn't know it longer matched reality. But here's what makes this story so chilling. The climate didn't crash overnight. It took thousands of years to tighten its grip. Imagine living in a world where each generation was slightly worse off than the last, but so gradually that no one could quite understand why life kept getting harder. The archaeological record from this period reads like a crime scene. Toolmaking became cruder as survival took priority over craftsmanship. Burial sites show increasing evidence of malnutrition. Most haunting of all, many settlements simply disappear. Not destroyed, abandoned. Their inhabitants scattered to the winds, leaving behind only the faintest traces that they ever existed. What we're looking at is the prelude to the greatest human catastrophe ever recorded. One so severe that it makes every war, every pandemic, every natural disaster in recorded history look like a minor setback. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about whether human consciousness itself would continue to exist in the universe. Recent genetic studies have revealed something that should make your blood run cold. At our lowest point, there may have been fewer humans alive on the entire planet than currently live in a small town. We came within a hair's breadth of joining the 99% of species that have ever lived and gone extinct. But somehow, impossibly, a few survived. And not just survived. They carried within their genetic code, their cultures, and their memories, everything that would eventually become us. The words you're hearing right now, the emotions you're feeling, the very capacity for wonder that brought you to this story, all of it traced back to those last 1,000 souls who refused to give up. So as we begin this journey together, remember, you're not just learning about the past, you're learning about the most successful survival story in human history. You're learning about your own origin story. Because every beat of your heart, every breath you take, every dream you dare to dream, exists because someone, somewhere in the depths of an ice age, decided to keep going for just one more day. Coming up next, we'll explore how paradise became a death trap and why our ancestors never saw it coming. But first, if this opening has grabbed your attention, 900,000 years ago, but here's the terrifying truth. It was all a lie. Not a deliberate deception. Nature doesn't lie on purpose. But what our ancestors experienced as abundance was actually a trap being set by planetary forces so vast and slow that no human mind could comprehend them. They were living in what scientists now call a climate optimum, a brief, beautiful interlude between ice ages. They had no way of knowing they were like flowers blooming in the calm before an eternal winter. The evidence of this golden age is written in stone, literally. Archaeological sites from this period reveal something unprecedented. Stability. The same tool-making techniques were passed down for thousands of years without major changes. Seasonal camps were used by generation after generation. These weren't nomads desperately searching for resources. These were people who had found their place in the world. But here's where the story gets controversial. Some researchers argue that this very stability made our ancestors vulnerable. They became specialists, perfectly adapted to one set of conditions. When those conditions changed, they were trapped in their own success. Dr. Sarah Chen at Stanford has proposed what she calls the paradise trap hypothesis. She argues that humans during this period developed what we might recognize as civilization. Permanent settlements, specialized roles, maybe even early agriculture. And when the climate shifted, they couldn't adapt quickly enough. They had become too dependent on their perfect world. Other scientists violently disagree. Dr. Marcus Weber at Cambridge insists that there's no evidence for advanced civilization this early. He argues that our ancestors remained flexible hunter-gatherers right up until the Ice Age hit. The debate has split the scientific community and occasionally erupted into very public arguments at conferences. Who's right matters more than you might think. Because if Chen is correct, it means our ancestors faced a choice: adapt or die. And the archaeological record suggests that most chose poorly. Let me share something that will make you question everything you think you know about human nature. At a site called Boxgrove in southern England, archaeologists found something disturbing. Layer after layer of tools and animal bones, showing continuous habitation for thousands of years. Then, our ancestors faced choices that would break us. And the fact that you exist means someone made the hard choices. Someone crossed lines. Someone did whatever it took. This isn't just about ancient history. It's about understanding what humans are truly capable of when pushed to the edge. And we're going to be pushed to that edge over and over again in this story. The climate data from ice cores tells us exactly how the trap was sprung. Earth's orbital patterns, its tilt, its distance from the sun, its wobble through space, all began shifting in subtle ways. These Milankovitch cycles, as scientists call them, operate over tens of thousands of years. To our ancestors, they were invisible, but the effects weren't invisible. Year by year, summers grew shorter and cooler. Year by year, winters lingered longer. Snow that used to melt in spring began lasting through summer, and in the far north, glaciers that had slept for millennia began to wake up. This is where the story becomes personal for everyone listening. Because as these glaciers grew, they didn't just change the landscape, they changed the entire atmosphere of the planet. Cold, dry air began flowing south. Rain patterns shifted. Forests began to die from the edges inward. And our ancestors, perfectly adapted to their paradise, began to realize that paradise was disappearing around them. Think about your own life for a moment. How quickly could you adapt if everything you relied on stopped working? If your job disappeared? If your food sources became unreliable? If the very climate around your home changed dramatically? Now imagine having no technology beyond fire and stone tools. No weather forecasts. No understanding of global climate patterns. No way to even comprehend what was happening. The archaeological sites from this transition period tell a story of confusion and desperation. Tools made from local stone are suddenly replaced by tools made from materials that had to be carried hundreds of miles. This suggests groups were ranging farther and farther to find resources, breaking ancient patterns that had worked for millennia. Settlement sites show evidence of conflict, burned structures, hasty burials, defensive positions. As resources became scarce, human groups that catastrophically. But first, I'm curious about something. Have you ever lived through a time when everything you counted on suddenly became uncertain? Share your story in the comments, because what you experienced might have more in common with our ancestors than you think. And if you're finding this story as gripping as I hope, please hit that like button. It helps me know you're ready for the even more intense chapters ahead. The paradise is crumbling, the ice is coming, and humanity is about to face its greatest test. Chapter 3. The Silent Assassin. How Climate Became Humanity's Hunter. Climate change isn't supposed to kill you quickly. It's not a predator with claws and teeth. It's not a disease that strikes in the night. Climate change is patient. It's methodical. It kills by making everything you know how to do slightly less effective, year after year, until one day you realize you've forgotten how to survive. That's exactly what began happening to our ancestors. The Ice Age didn't announce itself with dramatic catastrophes. Instead, it whispered. And that whisper was the most dangerous sound in human history. The first whisper was in the timing of seasons. For thousands of years, certain stars had appeared in the sky at the exact moment when specific plants ripened, when animals migrated, when it was safe to travel. These patterns were encoded in songs, stories, and rituals passed down through generations. Suddenly, the stars were lying. Spring arrived weeks later than expected. Autumn lasted longer, pushing winter into months when food stores typically lasted until the next growing season. Animals that had followed predictable migration routes for millennia began showing up in the wrong places at the wrong times, or not showing up at all. Dr. Elena Rodriguez at the Max Planck Institute has spent her career studying what she calls phenological disruption, the breakdown of natural timing systems. Her research suggests that these disruptions were far more devastating to early humans than actual temperature changes. Imagine, she explains, if every clock in the world started running at slightly different speeds. You might not notice at first, but eventually, nothing would coordinate properly. Society would collapse, not from any single catastrophic event, but from the breakdown of synchronized timing. Then, ominously, even these storage sites begin showing signs of being abandoned mid-season. Food left to rot because the groups that cached it never returned. But here's where the story takes a controversial turn. Some researchers believe that climate change didn't just threaten our ancestors' survival, it fundamentally changed their behavior in ways that we're only beginning to understand. Dr. James Crawford at Oxford has proposed what he calls the stress evolution hypothesis. He argues that the sustained environmental pressure of the early Ice Age triggered rapid psychological evolution in human populations. The humans who survived weren't just those with better tools or more food. They were those whose brains adapted to constant uncertainty. Crawford's theory is explosive in academic circles because it suggests that modern human psychology, including traits like anxiety, hypervigilance, and obsessive planning, evolved as survival adaptations during this period. In other words, your tendency to worry about the future might be a genetic gift from ancestors who survived because they couldn't stop worrying about the future. Critics of Crawford's work argue that he's oversimplifying both evolution and psychology. Dr. Patricia Huang at Berkeley points out that there's no direct evidence for rapid psychological evolution in the archaeological record. Crawford is building a castle of speculation on a foundation of scattered bones, she argues. But Crawford fires back with genetic evidence. Modern human populations show signs of what geneticists call selective sweeps, periods when certain genetic variants became much more common very quickly. Some of these sweeps date to exactly the period we're discussing. The brain changes we see in modern humans didn't evolve gradually over millions of years, Crawford insists. They evolved rapidly, under intense pressure, in response to environmental chaos. We are the descendants of humans whose minds were forged by crisis. Whether Crawford is right or wrong, there's no debating that our ancestors' world was becoming increasingly hostile. The archaeological record shows sites being occupied for shorter and shorter periods. Where once groups might have spent entire seasons in one location, they now moved constantly, never staying long enough to leave substantial traces. This nomadic pattern created a new problem: information breakdown. Knowledge about local evidence of failed experiments. Attempts to use obviously unsuitable materials for tools, or to process foods in ways that would have made them toxic rather than nutritious. These are the archaeological signatures of people trying to survive in environments they didn't understand, using knowledge that no longer applied. The climate was teaching our ancestors a harsh lesson. Specialization is vulnerability. The groups that survived were those that could become generalists quickly, that could abandon everything they knew and learn entirely new ways of living. But there's a limit to how much change any population can absorb. And as we'll see in our next chapter, our ancestors were rapidly approaching that limit. The climate wasn't just changing their world, it was changing them at the cellular level. Take a moment to consider this. Every stress response in your body, every instinct to prepare for disaster, every sleepless night you've spent worrying about the future, might be echoing the experiences of ancestors who lived through the collapse of everything predictable in their world. If that thought gives you chills, hit that like button. And if you're wondering how close your own life might be to similar disruptions, share your thoughts in the comments. Because the lessons our ancestors learned about adaptation aren't just ancient history. They're a preview of challenges we might face ourselves. Coming up next, we'll examine the physical evidence of what this stress did to human bodies, and why the bones of our ancestors read like an autopsy report of a species under siege. The whispers are getting louder, the ice is closing in, and humanity is about to discover what it takes to survive when everything you know becomes useless. Chapter 4. Bones Don't Lie. Reading the Autopsy of Ancient Starvation. I need to warn you about what we're going to discuss next. We're about to examine the physical evidence of human suffering on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. The bones of our ancestors don't just tell us how they died. They tell us how badly they suffered while living. If you have a weak stomach, you might want to skip ahead. But if you want to understand what survival actually cost, if you want to know what your ancestors endured so that you could exist, then stay with me. Because the bone period. These lines form when growth stops temporarily due to severe malnutrition or disease. 1 or 2 lines might indicate a bad season. The skeleton Santos studies show 10, 15, sometimes 20 lines. These people experience chronic starvation from early childhood, Santos explains. Their bodies were constantly starting and stopping growth, trying to survive on inadequate nutrition for years at a time. But Harris lines are just the beginning. Cribra orbitalia, a condition where the bone behind the eye sockets becomes porous and spongy, appears in nearly 80% of skulls from this period. It's caused by severe, prolonged anemia. In modern populations, it's rare. In Ice Age populations, it was nearly universal. These weren't just hard times. These were populations living on the absolute edge of biological survival for generations. The teeth tell an even grimmer story. Enamel defects called enamel hypoplasias appear as horizontal grooves across the teeth. They form when the body is so starved of nutrients that it can't even maintain tooth formation. Dr. Richard Stone at Cambridge has counted these defects in hundreds of Ice Age specimens. The pattern is consistent and terrifying, Stone reports. These populations experience severe nutritional stress approximately every 2 to 3 years throughout their entire lives. They never recovered. They never had a period of abundance that allowed their bodies to fully heal. But perhaps most disturbing are the signs of what scientists call nutritional desperation. Evidence that people were eating things that were actively harmful rather than starve. Microscopic analysis of tooth wear patterns shows evidence of sand and grit consumption, suggesting that people were eating roots and tubers that hadn't been properly cleaned, or were so desperate that they ate anything remotely organic. Some teeth show wear patterns consistent with chewing on bones for extended periods, trying to extract every possible calorie. Even more controversially, some researchers have identified what they believe are signs of systematic cannibalism. Dr. Tim Ashford at Edinburgh has examined cut marks on human bones from multiple Ice Age sites. The patterns are unmistakable, Ashford argues. These bones were processed for food. The cut marks are in exactly the same locations where you'd expect to see them if someone was a fish. Identical. These people weren't just occasionally resorting to cannibalism. They were systematically processing human remains as a regular food source. The debate matters because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. What would you do? If your children were starving, if every other food source had failed, if eating the dead meant the difference between your family's survival and extinction, what choice would you make? The skeletal evidence suggests that some of our ancestors faced exactly that choice, and their decision is why we exist today. Even children's bones tell horrific stories. Growth rates were severely stunted across entire populations. Average adult height decreased dramatically during this period, not because of genetic changes, but because chronic malnutrition prevented normal development. Infant mortality rates, inferred from burial sites, appear to have exceeded 70% in some regions. For comparison, infant mortality in the poorest countries today rarely exceeds 10%. But here's what makes this evidence even more chilling. The populations that left these bones were the survivors. They were the groups that managed to endure long enough to leave archaeological traces. How many other groups simply vanished without leaving any evidence at all? The bones paint a picture of a species under siege, pushed so close to extinction that normal human behavior became impossible. Social structures broke down. Cultural traditions were abandoned. Everything that wasn't directly related to immediate survival was discarded. Yet somehow, incredibly, some survived. The question is, how? What strategies, what technologies, what psychological adaptations allowed even a few humans to endure conditions that killed almost everyone else? That's what we'll explore next. The moment when everything seemed lost and our species was reduced to its absolute minimum. But first, I need to ask, how are you feeling right now? Because if these revelations about human suffering disturb you, you're having exactly the right response. Hit that like button if you're ready to continue this difficult journey. And share in the comments. Do you think you could have made the choices our ancestors made? Because we're about to discover that survival required more than just physical endurance. Geneticists puts it bluntly, When we map the genetic diversity of modern humans and work backward through time, we hit a wall around 900,000 to 800,000 years ago. A wall made of missing people. What Wells means is that the genetic evidence points to something so catastrophic that it defies imagination. The total breeding population of human ancestors dropped to somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 individuals worldwide. And that's being optimistic. Some researchers believe the number was much lower. Dr. Lynn Geordie at the University of Utah has analyzed mitochondrial DNA from populations across 6 continents. His calculations suggest an effective breeding population of as few as 600 individuals at the Bottleneck's worst point. 600 people, Geordie emphasizes. That's smaller than most high schools. That's fewer people than live in many apartment buildings. The entire future of human consciousness depended on a group of people who could have fit in a movie theater. But here's where the story becomes almost unbelievable. This bottleneck didn't last for a few years, or even a few decades. Genetic evidence suggests it persisted for 60,000 to 100,000 years. Multiple millennia of humanity, balanced on the absolute knife's edge of extinction. Think about that timeline. If this happened today, it would span from the time of ancient Egypt until now. Imagine 4,000 years of your descendants living under constant threat of complete annihilation, never knowing if they represented the last generation of humans who would ever exist. The archaeological evidence for this period is haunting in its scarcity. Dr. Sarah Johnson at the Smithsonian has surveyed Paleolithic sites across Africa, Europe, and Asia. There are vast geographical regions that show no human presence whatsoever during this period, she reports. Places that had been continuously occupied for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly go silent. But where Johnson sees absence, others see something more disturbing. Dr. Michael Cohen at Tel Aviv University believes the lack of archaeological sites isn't just due to population decline. It's due to behavioral changes so extreme that they're almost impossible to detect in the archaeological record. These people weren't building permanent settlements, Cohen argues. They weren't making elaborate tools if they learned to survive by becoming invisible. Dr. Rebecca Martinez at Stanford has spent years trying to solve this puzzle. She's developed new techniques for identifying what she calls ephemeral occupation sites. Places where humans stayed for only days or weeks, leaving minimal traces. We've been looking for the wrong kind of evidence, Martinez explains. We've been expecting permanent campsites, elaborate tool assemblages, formal burial sites. But survival populations don't have the luxury of permanence. They move constantly, travel light, and adapt to whatever resources they can find immediately. Martinez's work has identified possible ghost sites across Africa and southern Europe, places with minimal tool scatters, tiny fire pits, and evidence of very short-term occupation. If she's right, these sites represent the archaeological signature of a species in full survival mode. But the genetic evidence reveals something even more disturbing than simple population decline. Analysis of ancient DNA shows signs of what researchers call genetic purging, the loss of entire lineages that had existed for millions of years. Dr. David Reich at Harvard has compared genetic diversity in pre-bottleneck populations with post-bottleneck survivors. We lost approximately 95% of existing genetic lineages, Reich reports. Entire branches of the human family tree were simply cut off and never recovered. This wasn't gradual attrition. This was sudden, massive elimination of genetic variation that had taken millions of years to accumulate. In population genetics terms, it was equivalent to a near-extinction event. The genetic diversity we lost during this bottleneck was irreplaceable, Reich explains. Some of that variation might have included adaptations to diseases we can't fight, environmental conditions we can't tolerate, or cognitive abilities we can't access. We're a fundamentally impoverished species compared to what we once were. The controversy in academic circles is fierce. Some researchers argue that the bottleneck was even more severe than these estimates suggest. Dr. Alan Rogers at the University of Utah believes the breeding population may have dropped as low as 40 individuals at certain points. 40 people, Rogers states flatly. The entire genetic future of our species may have depended on the reproductive success of fewer people extinction during this period than at any other time in our species' history. We were, in the most literal sense, an endangered species, teetering on the brink of oblivion. The question that haunts researchers is simple. How? How did such a small population survive for so long under such hostile conditions? What strategies, technologies, or social innovations allowed them to persist when everything suggested they should have vanished? The answer involves fire, cooperation, and possibly the most controversial survival strategy in human history. If you're still with me after learning that you're descended from what was essentially an endangered species, hit that like button. And I want to know, does learning about humanity's brush with extinction change how you think about your own existence? Share your thoughts in the comments. Coming up next, we'll discover the technology that may have saved our species, and why controlling fire was more revolutionary than we ever imagined. The Great Dying is behind us, but barely. Now we need to understand how the survivors fought back against extinction itself. Chapter 6. Firekeepers, the technology that saved our species. Fire didn't just cook food or provide warmth for our ancestors. Fire was the difference between existence and extinction. It was the technology that transformed humans from just another endangered species into something that could fight back against an ice age. But here's what most people don't understand. Maintaining fire during the ice age wasn't just difficult. It was a full-time job that required skills we've completely forgotten. And recent archaeological discoveries suggest that the groups who mastered fire weren't just more comfortable than their neighbors. They were the only ones who survived at all. Dr. Will Robrooks at Leiden University has revolutionized our understanding of Ice Age fire use through his analysis of sites across Europe and Africa. What he's found challenges everything we thought we knew about early human technology. Fire wasn't a convenience for these populations, Robrooks explains. It was their primary survival technology. But more than that, it was their social organizing principle, their manufacturing center, their food processing plant, and their pharmaceutical laboratory, all rolled into one. The evidence is written in ash layers, burned stones, and microscopic charcoal fragments for analyzing ancient ash that reveal exactly how our ancestors solved these problems. Her work shows evidence of sophisticated fire management strategies that modern survival experts struggle to replicate. They weren't just building campfires, Shahak Gross reports. They were creating what we might call fire infrastructure, systems for capturing, storing, transporting, and maintaining combustion under the most challenging conditions imaginable. One of the most remarkable discoveries is evidence of fire caching, deliberately burying prepared fire-starting materials at strategic locations along migration routes. At sites across Africa, archaeologists have found carefully prepared bundles of tinder, kindling, and fire-making tools buried in waterproof containers made from animal bladders or specially treated skins. This suggests long-term planning and cooperation on a scale that transforms our understanding of Ice Age human society. Creating and maintaining fire caches would have required coordinated effort across multiple groups, shared knowledge of routes and seasons, and trust that others would maintain the system. But fire technology went far beyond simple combustion. Chemical analysis of burned materials reveals that our ancestors had developed sophisticated understanding of how different materials burned, what temperatures they produced, and what chemical changes they could create in food and tools. Dr. Francesco Berna at Boston University has identified evidence of controlled pyrotechnology, the the deliberate use of specific fire temperatures to modify stone tools. At sites like Pinnacle Point in South Africa, humans were using fire to heat-treat stone to specific temperatures that made it easier to knap into tools. They had figured out that heating silicate stones to around 350 to 400 degrees Celsius would change the internal structure in ways that made them much easier to work with, Berner explains. This wasn't accidental. This was systematic, scientific experimentation with materials engineering. Even more remarkably, there's evidence that different groups developed different pyrotechnological traditions, specialized knowledge of working with local materials that gave them survival advantages in specific environments. But perhaps the most controversial aspect of Ice Age fire technology involves what researchers euphemistically call protein processing. Chemical analysis of burned bone fragments reveals evidence of connective tissues into digestible proteins and potentially rendering human remains safe for consumption. Cole's work has sparked fierce academic debate because it provides the clearest evidence yet that cannibalism wasn't just occasional desperation behavior during the Bottleneck. It was a systematic survival strategy made possible by advanced fire technology. I'm not making moral judgments, Cole emphasizes. I'm reporting what the archaeological chemistry tells us. These people developed sophisticated techniques for extracting maximum nutritional value from any organic material available, including human remains. Fire also enabled what might be the most important survival strategy of all: information processing. Around fires, in the safety of light and warmth, humans could share knowledge, plan movements, pass down crucial survival information, and maintain the social bonds that held groups together. Dr. Richard Wrangham at Harvard argues that fire was the technology that made modern human cognition possible. The extra calories from cooked food, he suggests, provided the energy budget necessary for developing larger brains. Fire didn't just help humans survive the Ice Age, Wrangham argues. Fire created humans as we know them today. The cognitive abilities that allowed for complex planning, sophisticated tool-making, and social cooperation all depended on the extra nutrition that fire technology provided. Recent genetic studies support Wrangham's theory. Humans show clear genetic adaptations for digesting cooked foods that other primates lack. These adaptations appear to have evolved rapidly during exactly the period we've been discussing. The archaeological evidence suggests that by the height of the Bottleneck, fire technology had become so sophisticated that the groups who mastered it gained enormous advantages over those who hadn't. Firekeepers could live in environments that were uninhabitable for others, extract nutrition from resources others couldn't use, and maintain social structures that others couldn't sustain. In essence, fire technology created a new ecological niche, one that allowed a tiny population of humans to survive conditions that would have been impossible for any other primate. But fire technology came with a cost. It required constant attention, specialized knowledge, and social cooperation. Groups had to organize their entire lives around fire maintenance. And as we'll see in our next chapter, question in human evolution. Did survival require abandoning our humanity, or did it require becoming more human than ever before? The Firekeepers survived, but what did they have to become in the process? Chapter 7, Cannibals or Saints, the dark truth about survival. We need to talk about something that makes people uncomfortable. Something that challenges our basic assumptions about human nature and morality. Because the archaeological evidence from the Ice Age Bottleneck points to a disturbing possibility. The humans who survived to become our ancestors may have done things that we would consider monstrous today. The question isn't whether cannibalism occurred during the Bottleneck. The evidence for that is overwhelming. The question is whether it was systematic, organized, and, most disturbing of all, whether it may have been the primary strategy that allowed our species to survive. Dr. James Cole at the University of Brighton doesn't mince words about what he's found in the archaeological record. We have clear evidence of human remains being processed for food at multiple sites across different continents during the Bottleneck period. This wasn't occasional desperation behavior. This was systematic resource management. Cole's analysis is based on cut marks, burning patterns, and bone fragmentation that match experimental data for efficient meat processing. But what makes his findings controversial isn't just the evidence of cannibalism, it's the evidence of organization. The processing patterns suggest knowledge, planning, and social cooperation, Cole explains. These weren't random acts of desperation. These were coordinated group activities with clear roles and procedures. At Goff's Cave in England, human bones from the Ice Age period show systematic processing that mirrors the way animal bones were handled at the same site. Skulls were modified into drinking cups. Long bones were cracked for marrow extraction. Even teeth were removed and potentially used as tools or ornaments. Dr. Sylvia Bello at the Natural History Museum in London has conducted detailed forensic analysis of these remains. Her findings paint a picture of what she calls ritualized consumption. This wasn't mindless butchery, Bello reports. The modifications to skulls show careful, skilled work. The removal of facial skin followed specific patterns. Cannibalism may have been how groups made decisions about who lived and who died. It was a form of resource allocation that ensured the survival of the most productive members. Ashford's hypothesis suggests that the elderly, disabled, or sick may have been systematically processed for food to ensure that younger, more capable individuals had enough resources to survive and reproduce. The ethical implications are staggering. If Ashford is right, it means our ancestors survived by developing social systems based on utilitarian calculations about human worth that we would find abhorrent today. Dr. Rebecca Ragg-Sykes at the University of Liverpool vehemently disagrees with Ashford's interpretation. Ashford is projecting modern economic thinking onto ancient behavior, she argues. There's no evidence that these groups were making calculated decisions about human value. Cannibalism could have been driven by entirely different cultural or spiritual motivations. Ragg-Sykes points to evidence of careful treatment of human remains at some sites. Bodies placed in specific positions, skulls modified for use as ceremonial objects rather than simple tools. She argues this suggests reverence rather than callous resource management. These people may have believed that consuming the dead was a way of preserving their essence, their knowledge, their strength within the group. Ragg-Sykes suggests it could have been an act of love rather than an act of survival. But the debate goes deeper than academic interpretation. It forces us to confront fundamental questions about human nature and morality under extreme conditions. Dr. Martha Bielecki at Warsaw University has studied modern cases of survival cannibalism, situations where people have resorted to eating human flesh to avoid starvation. Her research reveals patterns that mirror some of the archaeological evidence from the Ice Age. When people are truly desperate, they develop elaborate justifications and rituals around cannibalism. Bielecki reports. They create rules about who can be consumed, how the consumption occurs, and what meaning it has for group survival. It becomes systematized very quickly. Bielecki's work suggests that the organized patterns researchers see in Ice Age sites might reflect psychological mechanisms for coping with extreme moral stress, rather than cold calculation about suggests that the populations who survived the bottleneck weren't just lucky. They were genetically different from the populations that didn't survive. Dr. David Reich at Harvard has identified genetic variants that became much more common during the bottleneck period. Some of these variants affect brain chemistry in ways that might influence social behavior, stress response, and moral reasoning. We may be looking at rapid evolution of psychological traits that helped humans cope with the extreme social stresses of survival cannibalism, Reich suggests. The people who could psychologically handle systematic resource management involving human consumption may have had survival advantages. If Reich is right, it means the capacity for extreme moral flexibility under crisis conditions isn't just learned behavior. It's partly genetic, inherited from ancestors who survived because they could do whatever survival required. This possibility is deeply uncomfortable because it suggests that modern humans carry genetic predispositions toward behaviors we consider morally unacceptable. We may be the descendants of people who survived precisely because they were capable of crossing moral lines that others couldn't cross. But there's another interpretation of the evidence that's more hopeful. Some researchers argue that the organizational complexity required for systematic cannibalism actually demonstrates enhanced humanity rather than diminished humanity. Dr. Christopher Bohm at USC points out that even survival cannibalism requires tremendous social cooperation, emotional support, and cultural innovation. The fact that these groups maintain social cohesion while engaging in such psychologically difficult behavior suggests extraordinary human capacities for adaptation and mutual support, Bohm argues. Maybe what we're seeing isn't evidence of humans becoming monsters, but evidence of humans becoming so committed to group survival that they were willing to sacrifice individual moral comfort for collective continuity. The question remains, were our ancestors cannibals or saints? The answer may be that they were both. People who did terrible things for noble reasons, who crossed moral lines to preserve the possibility of morality itself continuing to exist in the universe. If this exploration of human moral complexity under extreme conditions has challenged your assumptions, hit that like button. And I want to know, do you think there are moral lines you would never cross, something we might not recognize as fully human? But was that transformation temporary, or do we still carry its traces within us? Chapter 8. The Toba controversy. Did a supervolcano nearly end us? Imagine waking up one morning to find that the sun has disappeared, not behind clouds but completely gone, as if someone turned off the lights on the entire planet. Imagine temperatures dropping by 20 degrees Celsius within weeks. Imagine acid rain that kills plants on contact and ash so thick that it suffocates animals in their sleep. Now imagine that this volcanic winter lasts not for months, but for years, maybe decades. This wasn't a nightmare. This may have been reality for our ancestors 74,000 years ago, when Mount Toba erupted with a force that makes modern volcanic eruptions look like firecrackers. And according to one of the most controversial theories in human evolution, this single event may have pushed our species so close to extinction that we never fully recovered. The Toba eruption was the largest volcanic event in human history. Dr. Michael Rampino at NYU, who has spent decades studying the eruption's effects, describes it as an extinction-level event that makes the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs look modest by comparison. The numbers are staggering. Toba ejected approximately 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. For perspective, that's enough volcanic debris to bury the entire United States under a layer of ash several meters thick. The eruption was heard thousands of kilometers away and sent shockwaves around the globe multiple times. But the immediate destruction was just the beginning. The ash and sulfur dioxide launched into the stratosphere created a global cooling event that lasted for years. Temperatures dropped dramatically across the planet. In some regions, average temperatures may have fallen by 15 to 20 degrees Celsius for up to a decade. Dr. Stanley Ambrose at the University of Illinois has proposed what's known as the Toba catastrophe theory. The idea that this eruption created a severe genetic bottleneck in human populations that explains why modern humans show such limited genetic diversity. The genetic evidence points to a severe population bottleneck around 70,000 years ago, Ambrose argues. The timing matches the time of the Toba eruption. Middle Paleolithic tool traditions that had persisted for thousands of years suddenly disappear, replaced by cruder, more expedient technologies. Dr. Ravi Korasetta at Karnataka University has excavated multiple sites in India that show this pattern. There's a clear technological regression following the Toba horizon, he reports. Sophisticated tool-making traditions are replaced by simple, hastily made implements. This suggests populations under severe stress, focused entirely on immediate survival. But the Toba theory has generated fierce opposition from other researchers who argue that Ambrose is overstating both the eruption's effects and its role in human evolution. Dr. Christine Lane at Oxford has conducted detailed climate modelling of the Toba eruption's effects. Her results suggest that, while the eruption certainly caused global cooling, the effects may have been less severe and shorter-lived than Ambrose proposes. The climate models show significant cooling, but not the kind of prolonged global catastrophe that would cause a species-wide bottleneck, Lane argues. Humans are remarkably adaptable. They could have survived localized cooling events without experiencing near-extinction. Dr. John Hawkes at the University of Wisconsin takes an even stronger position against the Toba theory. He argues that the genetic evidence doesn't actually support a severe bottleneck at 70,000 years ago. When you analyze the genetic data carefully, the bottleneck signal is much older and much more gradual than Ambrose suggests. Hawkes contends the Toba eruption was certainly a significant event, but there's no evidence it caused a population crash severe enough to explain modern human genetic patterns. The debate has become increasingly heated as new evidence emerges from both sides. Recent excavations in Africa have found sites that show continuous occupation through the period when Toba erupted, suggesting that at least some human populations weren't severely affected. Dr. Curtis Moran at Arizona State University has excavated Pinnacle Point Cave in South Africa, which shows clear evidence of human occupation before, during, and after the Toba event. We see no break in occupation, no change in technology, no evidence of population stress at Pinnacle. Thousands of years of Toba-induced climate stress. Recent chemical analysis of ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica has provided new evidence that the Toba eruption did cause significant global climate disruption. Sulfur spikes in the ice cores match the timing of the eruption and suggest that the volcanic winter lasted for at least 6 years. Dr. Gifford Miller at the University of Colorado has analyzed these ice core records in detail. The chemical signature is unmistakable, Miller reports. Toba caused the most severe volcanic winter in human history. Whether that translates to a genetic bottleneck is debatable, but the climate impact was certainly severe enough to stress human populations globally. The controversy matters because it touches on fundamental questions about human resilience and vulnerability. If the Toba theory is correct, it suggests that our species has survived at least one extinction-level event in our recent evolutionary history. It means we're the descendants of people who endured conditions that would challenge modern civilization. But if the critics are right, it suggests that humans are more resilient than we might think, capable of surviving even massive volcanic eruptions without experiencing species-level threats. The debate also has implications for modern risk assessment. If a Toba-scale eruption occurred today, would modern human civilization be better equipped to handle it than our Stone Age ancestors? Or would our technological complexity make us more vulnerable to cascading system failures? Recent volcanic monitoring has identified several supervolcanoes that could potentially produce Toba-scale eruptions, including Yellowstone in the United States and Campi Flegrei in Italy. Understanding how our ancestors survived the last supervolcanic winter might be crucial for surviving the next one. The Toba controversy remains unresolved, but it forces us to confront the possibility that human survival has always been more precarious than we like to admit. Whether it was Toba specifically, or some other catastrophic event, our species clearly experienced a severe bottleneck that brought us to the edge of extinction. If learning about the Toba controversy has made you think about modern volcanic risks, hit that like button. And I'm curious, do you think modern humans would be better or worse equipped to handle a Toba-scale eruption than our ancestors were? Luxury for our Ice Age ancestors. It was a survival technology. The capacity to form deep emotional bonds, to care about someone else's welfare, even when resources were desperately scarce, to choose cooperation over competition. These weren't beautiful human traits that developed during peaceful times. They were forged in the crucible of near-extinction, and they may be the primary reason our species survived at all. Dr. Helen Fisher at Rutgers University has spent decades studying the neurochemistry of love and attachment. Her recent work suggests that the brain circuits responsible for romantic bonding evolved rapidly during periods of extreme environmental stress. Exactly the conditions our ancestors faced during the Ice Age bottleneck. Love isn't just about reproduction, Fisher explains. It's about creating survival partnerships that can endure extreme hardship. The neurochemical systems that drive romantic attachment are also the systems that enable long-term cooperation, resource sharing, and coordinated planning under stress. The archaeological evidence supports Fisher's theory in ways that are both beautiful and heartbreaking. At sites across Europe and Africa, researchers have found burials that tell stories of devotion that transcend survival logic. At Sunghyr in Russia, archaeologists discovered the grave of a man who had lived with a severely disabling spinal condition. The deformities would have made him unable to hunt or gather effectively. Yet he lived to an advanced age and was buried with elaborate grave goods, including ivory jewelry and carefully crafted tools. Dr. Eric Trinkhaus at Washington University has analyzed the Sunghyr remains extensively. This individual could only have survived with sustained, long-term care from others, Trinkhaus reports. Someone loved him enough to provide for him for decades, even when resources were scarce enough that most groups couldn't afford to support non-productive members. Even more remarkable, the Sunghyr site contains the grave of 2 children, one about 10 years old, one about 12. Buried together with thousands of ivory beads, spears, and other artifacts. The labor investment in creating these grave goods would have required months of work by multiple people. These weren't practical burials, explains Dr. Alexandra Buzhilova, who led mates from genetically distinct populations, Reich reports. This wasn't random migration, it was systematic mate selection designed to maintain genetic diversity in small populations. These long-distance romantic partnerships would have required extraordinary commitment and coordination. Imagine traveling hundreds of kilometers through hostile terrain with limited technology and constant survival pressures to court someone from a different group. Dr. Sarah Hurdy at UC Davis argues that this kind of long-distance mate selection was crucial for avoiding the genetic problems that typically doom small populations. Inbreeding depression would have been a constant threat for bottleneck populations, Hurdy explains. The groups that survived were those that maintained romantic and sexual connections across wide geographical ranges. But maintaining these connections required more than just physical travel. It required emotional and cultural technologies that we're only beginning to understand. Cave art from the Ice Age period shows evidence of sophisticated symbolic communication systems. Recent analysis suggests that many of these symbols may have been love letters, ways of communicating romantic interest and emotional bonds across distances and time. Dr. Genevieve von Petzinger at the University of Victoria has catalogued geometric symbols from cave sites across Europe. She's identified consistent symbol patterns that appear at sites separated by thousands of kilometers and thousands of years. Some of these symbols may have functioned as a kind of romantic messaging system, von Petzinger suggests. Ways for individuals to communicate emotional states, relationship status, or intentions to potential mates from other groups. The implications are staggering. Our ancestors may have invented the first long-distance communication technologies, not for hunting or warfare, but for love. Even more remarkably, there's evidence that Ice Age humans developed sophisticated social rituals around mate selection and partnership formation. At sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, archaeologists have found evidence of large gatherings that brought together multiple groups during specific seasons. Dr. Jiří Svoboda, who has excavated Dolní Věstonice for decades, believes these gatherings served as marriage markets, where young people from different groups could meet, court. Dr. Antonio Damasio at USC has studied how emotional bonding affects decision-making under stress. His research suggests that romantic attachment actually makes people better at survival planning and risk assessment. Love makes us smarter about survival, Damasio explains. When you're emotionally bonded to someone, your brain becomes better at anticipating future needs, planning for contingencies, and making sacrifices for long-term benefits. This may explain why romantic love became so central to human psychology during the Bottleneck period. Groups that could maintain emotional bonds were groups that could coordinate complex survival strategies over long time periods. The archaeological record shows that the populations who survived the Bottleneck weren't just those with better tools or more food. They were those with stronger social bonds and more sophisticated emotional cultures. Love wasn't a luxury they couldn't afford, Fisher emphasizes. Love was the technology that allowed them to afford survival itself. If learning that romance was a survival technology changes how you think about love, hit that like button. And I want to know, do you think modern romantic relationships still serve survival functions? Or have they become purely emotional luxuries? Share your thoughts in the comments. Coming up next, we'll confront the most controversial question about our ancestors' survival. Did they succeed by cooperating with other human species, or by driving them to extinction? Love may have saved our species, but what happened to the other species of humans who didn't make it through the Bottleneck? Chapter 10. The Neanderthal Question. Did we kill or kiss our cousins? The greatest mystery in human evolution isn't what happened to us during the Ice Age Bottleneck. It's what happened to them. The other species of humans who shared our world for hundreds of thousands of years and then vanished just as we were beginning to recover. Were we their killers or their lovers? Did we drive them to extinction through violence and competition? Or did we love them into oblivion through interbreeding and assimilation? The answer to this question reveals something fundamental about human nature, and it's more disturbing than either extreme suggests. Dr. Svante Pääbo, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on ancient DNA, revolutionized our understanding of other human species during the Ice Age. They had children with them, lots of children. Non-African populations carry 2 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. Melanesian populations carry up to 6% Denisovan DNA. Some Asian populations show genetic contributions from an unknown archaic human species that researchers call Ghost Population X. But here's where the story becomes controversial. The pattern of genetic inheritance suggests that these weren't equal partnerships between species. They were something much more complex and morally ambiguous. Dr. Joshua Akey at Princeton has analyzed the distribution of archaic DNA in modern populations in unprecedented detail. His findings paint a picture of interspecies relationships that challenges our assumptions about both ancient and modern human behavior. The genetic patterns suggest systematic male-biased gene flow from archaic populations into modern human populations, Aki reports. This could indicate that modern human groups were incorporating archaic women into their populations, while excluding archaic men. In plain language, our male ancestors may have been taking Neanderthal and Denisovan women as mates, while killing or driving away the males. This is a pattern that anthropologists recognize from historical cases of conquest and colonization. Dr. Rebecca Ragg-Sykes at the University of Liverpool vehemently disagrees with this interpretation. As one of the world's leading Neanderthal experts, she argues that the genetic evidence could support multiple scenarios, many of which don't involve violence or coercion. Aki is projecting modern patterns of conflict onto ancient behavior, Ragg-Sykes argues. The genetic data could just as easily reflect peaceful cultural exchange, intermarriage between neighboring groups, or even Neanderthal groups voluntarily joining modern human populations for mutual benefit. But the archaeological evidence complicates both interpretations. At sites across Europe, the transition from Neanderthal occupation to modern human occupation is often marked by what researchers euphemistically call cultural discontinuity. Dr. Paul Mellers at Cambridge has studied this transition at dozens of sites. There are very few sites that show gradual cultural mixing between Neanderthals and modern humans, Mellers reports. What we typically see is Neanderthal occupation ending abruptly and modern environmental adaptation that gradually gave them competitive edges over Neanderthal populations. It wasn't necessarily violent conquest, Finlayson explains. It could have been economic displacement. Modern humans were slightly better at extracting resources from the same environments, so they gradually occupied the best territories, while Neanderthal populations were pushed into increasingly marginal areas. This kind of economic displacement wouldn't require deliberate aggression, but it would be just as effective at driving competitor populations to extinction, and it would explain why genetic mixing occurred. Neanderthal individuals might have joined modern human groups as their own populations became unsustainable. Recent discoveries have added new complexity to this debate. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, archaeologists have found evidence that Neanderthals were burying their dead with flowers and caring for disabled group members with the same devotion that modern humans showed at sites like Sungir. Dr. Emma Pomeroy, who led the recent Shanidar excavations, argues that this evidence demonstrates sophisticated Neanderthal emotional and social capabilities that make violent replacement scenarios less plausible. These weren't primitive brutes who could be easily overpowered by more advanced humans, Pomeroy emphasizes. These were sophisticated people with complex social relationships, advanced tool technologies, and deep emotional lives. Any interaction with modern humans would have been between equals. But Dr. John Hawkes at the University of Wisconsin points out that this emotional sophistication might have made Neanderthals more vulnerable, not less. Neanderthal social systems may have been optimized for small, stable groups with strong emotional bonds, Hawkes suggests. Modern humans may have had advantages in forming larger, more flexible social networks that gave them competitive advantages during the Bottleneck period. The genetic evidence adds another disturbing dimension to this debate. Analysis of ancient DNA shows that while modern humans carry archaic DNA from multiple species, there's very little modern human DNA in late Neanderthal populations. Dr. Kay Prufer at the Max Planck Institute has studied this asymmetric gene flow extensively. Genes were flowing from archaic populations into modern, experiencing their own severe bottleneck. While modern humans were struggling to survive themselves, they were simultaneously driving other human species to extinction, observes Dr. Chris Stringer at the Natural History Museum. This suggests that interspecies competition was so intense that even small advantages could determine which lineages survived. The implications are profound. Our ancestors survived the Ice Age bottleneck, not just through cooperation within their own species, but through competition with other human species that was so effective it drove their competitors to complete extinction. We are the descendants of the only human species that managed to survive the bottleneck, but we're also the descendants of the species that eliminated all the others. The DNA we carry from Neanderthals and Denisovans may be all that remains of entire lineages of human consciousness that our ancestors absorbed into extinction. If learning about our complex relationship with other human species has challenged your assumptions about human nature, hit that like button. And I want to know, do you think the extinction of other human species was inevitable? Or could multiple human species have survived to the modern era? Share your thoughts in the comments. Coming up next, we'll explore the psychological scars that the bottleneck left in our DNA, and why modern human behavior still reflects the trauma of near extinction. We survived, they didn't, and the reasons why reveal truths about human nature that we're still struggling to understand. Chapter 11. Ghosts in our DNA. The psychological scars we still carry. Every time you feel anxious about the future, every time you hoard resources just in case, every time you feel an inexplicable need to belong to a group or fear being rejected by others, you're experiencing echoes of the Ice Age bottleneck. The psychological traits that helped our ancestors survive near extinction are still active in your brain right now, influencing your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in ways you've never imagined. This isn't metaphorical. This isn't psychological speculation. This is genetic reality, written into your DNA and expressed through brain chemistry that evolved under conditions of extreme referring to are exactly the conditions our ancestors faced during the bottleneck. Chronic resource scarcity, unpredictable environmental changes, small group sizes where social rejection meant death, and constant uncertainty about survival. Consider anxiety. Modern anxiety disorders involve persistent worry about future threats, constant scanning for dangers, and physiological arousal that prepares the body for immediate action. These responses seem pathological in modern environments, where actual survival threats are rare. But Dr. Sarah Matthew at Arizona State has studied how these same anxiety responses function in small-scale societies that still live under conditions similar to those our ancestors faced. Her findings are remarkable. In environments where resources are unpredictable and threats are real, individuals with higher baseline anxiety levels are more successful at anticipating problems, preparing for contingencies, and avoiding dangerous situations, Matthew reports. What we call anxiety disorder in modern contexts was probably adaptive hypervigilance in Ice Age contexts. The genetic evidence supports this interpretation. Populations that survived the bottleneck show elevated frequencies of genetic variants associated with anxiety, depression, and obsessive-compulsive behaviors. These weren't random genetic changes. They were systematic selection for psychological traits that enhanced survival under extreme stress. Dr. Matthew Keller at the University of Colorado has studied the geographical distribution of these genetic variants. His findings reveal that populations whose ancestors experienced more severe bottleneck conditions show higher frequencies of genes associated with what we now consider mental health disorders. The same genetic variants that predispose people to anxiety and depression in modern environments may have been essential survival adaptations during the Ice Age, Keller explains. We're looking at genetic hangovers from a period when being constantly worried about the future was the difference between life and death. But the psychological legacy of the bottleneck extends beyond individual mental health patterns. It shaped fundamental aspects of human social behavior that we take for granted today. The intense human need for social belonging, for example, may reflect the fact that during the bottleneck, social rejection literally meant death. Groups were so small that being ostracized meant facing survival challenges alone.
Evolved because social isolation was a death sentence for our ancestors. This explains why humans show such extreme responses to social rejection, even in modern contexts where social isolation doesn't threaten survival. Our brains are still calibrated for Ice Age conditions, where group membership was essential for survival. The tendency to form in-groups and out-groups may also reflect bottleneck psychology. During periods of extreme scarcity, the ability to quickly identify who was part of your survival group versus who might be competing for the same resources was crucial for making rapid decisions about cooperation versus conflict. Dr. Susan Fiske at Princeton has studied how humans automatically categorize others into social groups within milliseconds of meeting them. This rapid social categorization appears to be unconscious and universal across all human cultures. We're constantly, automatically assessing whether other people are potential allies or potential threats, Fiske reports. This isn't learned behavior, it's a fundamental feature of human cognition that appears to be hardwired into our psychology. The hoarding behaviors that appear in various forms across human cultures may also reflect bottleneck psychology. The compulsion to store resources, to save for uncertain futures, to accumulate more than immediate needs require. These behaviors seem irrational in modern abundance, but would have been essential during periods of chronic scarcity. Dr. Stephanie Preston at the University of Michigan has studied hoarding behaviors across cultures and throughout human history. She argues that moderate hoarding tendencies are normal human behaviors that become problematic only in modern environments of artificial abundance. The drive to acquire and save resources is a fundamental survival mechanism, Preston explains. What we call hoarding disorder today may simply be extreme expression of psychological adaptations that once kept our ancestors alive during periods of scarcity. Even modern human reproductive behaviors may reflect bottleneck psychology. The intense pair bonding that characterizes human romantic relationships, the extended parental care that humans provide to offspring, and the complex negotiations around mating and reproduction all make more sense when viewed as adaptations to small population sizes, where every reproductive decision had enormous consequences for group survival. Dr. Sarah Hrdy at UC Davis argues that many aspects of human sexuality of bottleneck psychology extend beyond individual behavior to collective human patterns that shape modern societies. The tendency to create hierarchical social structures, the persistent human fascination with stories about survival and disaster, the universal human behaviors around food sharing and resource allocation. All of these may reflect psychological adaptations that evolved during our species' brush with extinction. Perhaps most importantly, understanding bottleneck psychology helps explain both human cooperation and human conflict. We are a species that evolved to cooperate intensely with in-group members, while competing ruthlessly with out-groups. We form the strongest social bonds of any primate, but we also engage in systematic violence against other humans in ways that other species rarely match. This psychological legacy isn't just historical curiosity. It affects how modern humans respond to crises, how we organize societies, and how we make decisions about resource allocation and social cooperation. If learning about the psychological echoes of the Ice Age bottleneck has helped you understand your own mental patterns differently. Hit that like button. And I'm curious, can you identify bottleneck psychology patterns in your own behavior? Do you think understanding these evolutionary origins changes how you view anxiety, social needs, or resource concerns? Share your insights in the comments. Coming up in our final chapter, we'll explore what the bottleneck story means for modern humans and why understanding our survival history might be crucial for our species' future. You carry the psychological legacy of the last 1,000 survivors, and understanding that legacy might be the key to ensuring our species survives the next bottleneck.